Well, hello there, and you're very welcome to the Sea and Sky, the Science of Conservation event, and it's all part of the Midlands Science Festival for Science Week 2021. Now, I'm your host, Dr. Barry Fitzgerald, and today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be exploring the science of conservation and biodiversity in terms of both sea and the sky. And for this discussion, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by two guests who are actively involved in conservation efforts with regards to the sea and the sky. Now, on the sea side of things, it's great to have Dr. Simon Berrow, the CEO of the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. He's been working on whales and dolphins in Ireland since 1987, and he has worked in the Antarctic region and off the coast of West Africa. In addition to that, he's a lecturer at the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology. It's great to have you here, Simon. And second of all, to explore the sky and the heavens, we're joined by Brian Cafferty of Birdwatch Ireland. He's currently leading the surveys and monitoring team, which has the responsibility of surveying and monitoring a range of national birds. And in addition to that, Brian is also on the European Bird Census Council. It's fantastic that you're both here for this discussion. So let's get straight into the discussion now. And I'd like to start with you, first of all, Simon, in relation to the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. Now, there might be some people out there who don't know about the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. Could you maybe briefly explain what you do?
Our primary aim is, I suppose, through research and education, we seek to conserve species and habitats, all 25 species of whales and dolphins that have been recorded in Irish waters. We run all island stranding and sighting schemes, so all whales and dolphins washed up on our shores, we have a network of people who go and visit them, record them, take samples for genetics, things like that, and we run sighting schemes. So I suppose, very much like Birdwatch Ireland, we are primary data gatherers, and that we believe that proper conservation and policies need to be supported and backed up by research. We have 1,000 members, we have local groups, we have probably 8 or 9 people here in Kilrush that contribute, and people around the country. So busy, very busy.
Sounds very busy. Now, it's great to hear that you're based in Kilrush, because that part of the country is very fond. It's a very important place in my heart, let's just say, because I'm actually living in the Netherlands, but anytime I go home, I'm always visiting that part of Ireland. I'm always going to Kilkee and going around the Loophead area. And I remember being there a few years ago, and I just was going for a walk around Loophead, and I remember staring out, I think it was down away from the lighthouse, and I was able to look out the Atlantic, and there was a small group of people that congregated, and they were watching what they were pretty sure was a whale. Now, I'd never seen a whale off the coast of Ireland ever. I'd seen dolphins before, but I'd never seen a whale. How frequent are these visits from whales around the coastal areas of Ireland?
Well, I suppose like all wildlife, it depends the time of year and where you are. So things change both geographically and seasonally. And I suppose that's one of the key parts of the sighting schemes, is that we generate the information to find out what occurs where and when. Not only just to identify important habitats and times of year, but to share the experience. If we can encourage people to go out and see and experience whales and dolphins for themselves, then we would hope that it would change their mentality and attitude towards the marine environment. So Loophead, I started watching Loophead in 1991, and we'd rarely see dolphins. Now we see bottlenose dolphins all the time. The reason we're in the Shannon Estuary is we are on the shore of a marine protected area under European law, an SAC, with bottlenose dolphins as a qualifying interest. It was the first MPA for dolphins in Ireland, and that's why I ended up moving back here and setting up a whole research and education structure around that. If you asked me this 2 years ago, I'd say we see minke whales in the autumn and the summer. This year's been phenomenal, Barry. We have had humpback whales and fin whales off the West Clare coast, close enough to see from shore. It's never been like that before. And I suppose, for your listeners, things are changing all the time. So that's why it's important that research and monitoring is maintained and kept going, so that we have empirical and new data. And I'm sure Brian said the same with birds, because we're living in a very changing environment. So some parts of Ireland, you have a very, very high chance of seeing whales, humpback whales especially. We either said West Cork, West Kerry, but this year and last year, especially this year, it's all pushing up the west coast. We've had lots of sightings off Galway, off Donegal, off Mayo. So it's actually a really good news story that whales are returning after years of exploitation, coming to inshore Irish waters, being accessible by people to see them from land, and supporting a whale watching tourism industry. So it's a real good news story.
That sounds fantastic, actually, and it's also something that people will pique their interest in, everything in relation to the sea and the oceans, the opportunity then to see something which sounds quite exotic in terms of almost up close and personal with a whale in the wild. Now, in terms of Birdwatch Ireland, Brian, I mentioned there at the start that you're involved in surveying and monitoring programs for birds in Ireland. Could you maybe briefly outline some of those programs and also the other activities that Birdwatch Ireland is involved in?
Yeah, sure, Barry. So I suppose in Birdwatch Ireland we've got quite a wide remit. So we carried a lot of surveys to check on the numbers and the status of our bird species in Ireland, to figure out how they're faring. That then allows us to, figure out the species that are most in danger, most in threat, perhaps prioritise those from a policy perspective or for our conservation projects. So those that are most endangered, most threatened, the likes of the, breeding waders, such as we hear a lot about the decline of the curlew at present. We would have conservation projects in place to try and protect those species. So on the ground action to try and do something to protect the most threatened birds. We manage a network of nature reserves around the country, so incredible places that are managed specifically for birds and biodiversity. We've a very active policy and advocacy element to the organisation that I suppose give a voice to birds and help to do what's needed to lobby and do our bit to protect their species. And we also have a really strong branch network across the country. So most counties in Ireland have a local branch of Birdwatch Ireland and a really active network of volunteers. So going back to the original part, the surveys and the monitoring, most of those are carried out by this really dedicated, skilled band of volunteers that go out during summer, spring, winter, during all weathers, counting birds, which provides this really important data set so that we can figure out how our species are faring over time. So I suppose quite a wide remit within the organisation.
Well, again, you've something quite in common with what Simon is doing with the Irish Whale and Dolphin group. You'll have a large group of members and everyone contributing in some way to the organisation, towards the goals and towards the collection of data, which I think is fantastic to see and to hear. Now, I've got a kind of a question I want to ask before we move on. Now, my father is a pigeon fancier. He's been racing pigeons for more than 50 years. And of course, when they go off for a race, not all the pigeons come back. And there are various reasons why they don't come back, of course. And among those are birds of prey. And I've seen birds of prey in action attacking my father's pigeons and also other birds around where I'm from. I'm from Limerick and Mungret, just outside the city, and I've seen this a couple of times. Just out of a personal interest, how many different species of birds of prey would you find in Ireland?
So I think there's around 10 or 11 birds of prey that you'd say kind of regularly breed in Ireland. There's probably another 4 or 5 that the like say osprey, that they don't nest in Ireland but they pass down during the spring or autumn time, passing through Ireland, going to their nesting grounds further north. But regularly occurring raptors probably about 11. But quite a spectacle to see, whether it's the peregrine falcon after the pigeons, or whether it's now we're in season now for starling murmurations coming together to roost every evening. And quite often you might go and you might be lucky enough to see maybe a sparrowhawk diving into the huge murmuration of starlings and watching them it's really incredible to watch.
And those patterns are incredible. I've watched them here in the Netherlands as well, but I also know that those murmurations actually serve to kind of disorientate the birds of prey as well. Makes it harder for them to actually pick out one, and I can imagine why, because the birds of prey are they dive into which one am I going to take, and then suddenly the whole thing is shifting and moving and I did some research on how those murmurations take place and how they all evolve, and it's just the physics that's involved. A lot of people don't think there's physics in there, but there is. It's just phenomenal what those groups of birds actually do. Well, right, let's get on some of the key issues then. First of all, let's start a little chat about the science of conservation, particularly surrounding, I'd say, farming and fishing. Now, we're more than aware that there are habitats on the island that have been negatively affected by human activities for years, and certain organisations like yourselves are striving to inform people not only about the species that live in the vicinity of the island, whether that's in the oceans and seas or whether around on the trees and in the land and the sky above us, but also to inform people about the issues that are facing these species and these species who call Ireland home. But the conservation requires stakeholders to take part in the process, whether it's organisations like Birdwatch Ireland and the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group or governmental departments. And the first question maybe I'd like to put to both of you, we'll start with you, Simon, is how can all of these stakeholders work constructively on these issues, given that some stakeholders are committed to other initiatives that may be contradictory?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great challenge, and I think possibly me and Brian probably slightly different in terms of it's harder to identify stakeholders in some ways in the sea. Because there's no boundaries. You don't put a fence around a piece of land and say, I have responsibility for this. So it is a bigger challenge. I mean, clearly coastal communities, fishing organisations, fishermen are key stakeholders. But I would argue that just because you're living in Cavan or Offaly, you're still an islander. You're never far from the sea. We're an island, and everything that we do is dictated by our geographical position in terms of goods and services coming in by sea. We've got huge biodiversity, we've got huge resources, wind, wave, fish. So, I don't agree that it's down to the people who live on the coast. There are the sole stakeholders. I think the biggest challenge really, and we'd be further behind than developments on land, is respecting people, to be honest. Respect people, respect their opinion, listen to them. There's an awful lot of shouting that goes on, shouting your opinion, especially on social media, which can be incredibly negative power behind it. So I think respect and dialogue is the key. Both of us are science-based organisations, and I hear a lot when we're talking about things like marine protected areas or offshore renewables, is that decisions have to be based on scientific evidence that can support a designation or an argument. And I think we are lacking in that key data in Ireland. We don't have very good long-term monitoring projects in place, so we're all automatically on a back step. And often you'll hear in these debates that we have expert opinion, and you're thinking we're not all experts. You know what I mean? So I think you need the data, because that backs up an opinion. It's a science-based opinion. And I think a big challenge for Ireland, especially from a marine perspective, is to devolve some of the power. Is that I think that if you have locally based stakeholder groups that have real power to make decisions and to affect change locally, they then also take responsibility for those decisions and are therefore accountable to those decisions. So once you've identified, what are your key objectives, what are your actions, then let people locally act that. Don't just get power down from Dublin or blame Dublin for everything. So that takes quite a major mindset for, if you like, government and civil servants to actually devolve real power to local stakeholder groups that take responsibility for their ownership. So I think if we do that, I think it starts the line. I think a lot of these things, these new challenges that are certainly facing our coastal environment, it does take time for people to process information, to discuss with their neighbours over a pint, whatever, and to come back. So I think we need to give time for people to come around to changes in things, the way things are done. And unfortunately, we don't have time. We're 10 years behind where we should have been on things like marine protected areas. Yeah. So we're playing catch up.
Brian, from your perspective, do you agree with what Simon is saying in respect to Birdwatch Ireland and the initiatives that Birdwatch Ireland are trying to implement and put in place?
Yeah, I do. It strikes a chord what he's saying, all right. And in terms of the stakeholders, I suppose if we're talking about the land, we in Birdwatch Ireland, we would deal with a huge number of stakeholders across the country on a load of different fronts. But I suppose if we're talking about how we can work constructively on issues, and especially where there are large differences, I suppose one prime example that is often thrown up is and probably quite timely now with all the news we're hearing the past week with the COP and the challenges that are emerging from there, and the challenges that we face. But one that is often thrown out is agriculture, and the loss of biodiversity on farmland, the climate change challenge that we face, how the emissions from agriculture contribute to that. But I think, in answer to your question, one of the ways forward is that we recognise that we're all essentially working towards the same thing. So in terms of climate change, for example, in agriculture, I've been based for many years in Banagher in County Offaly in the Midlands, and on the Shannon. We've been working on corncrakes there for over the years, for many years, and it was summer flooding caused by climate change that was really the nail in the coffin for corncrakes in the Callows. But summer flooding was also horrendous for the local farmers in the Midlands. So when the Callows would flood during the summer, often they would lose their crop for that season, and it was terrible. So the joint way forward was, well, something needs to be done on this to both try and help the farmers, but also to try and save the birds. So I think if we can try and identify the common ground where we need to work together, where it's of benefit to both biodiversity, climate change, and the industry, in this case farming, that's the way we need to do it. And in terms of farming and climate change, for example, there's loads of things that could be done that are of benefit to both.
I think that's a very good point you've made in relation to not only preserving the species and making sure their habitat is there, but also that habitat serves another purpose for example, the farming community to produce a particular crop or something around a seasonal period of the time. And this collaboration, this idea of working together with people from different areas, that leads me to my next question in terms of your two organisations, which have some, of course, overlap, because you have sea-dwelling birds or species that would be visiting the coastal areas of Ireland and would call that home and interact with what we have there. How do your organisations, or do you work together on any initiatives in relation to the coastal areas, and what do you think others can learn from such cooperations? Simon?
Yeah, probably not as much as we should, to be honest, Barry. I mean, clearly Birdwatch have got a very active seabird conservation group, headed by Steve Newton, and have strong policy work. We all are under the Irish Environmental Network, so we are all represented by a coordinating body. So the idea of that is the government get a more joined up kind of a response from NGOs in terms of policy input. So that's an important umbrella body. But it's interesting that we're just launching a big 3-year MPA campaign, and it's a consortium of 7 key NGOs, including Birdwatch Ireland and the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, to try and hold the government to account to designate 30% of our waters by 2030, 30 by 30. And even just going through the application process has taken many months. It's been really interesting having these calls with fellow NGOs, Irish Wildlife Trust, Coastwatch, Birdwatch, and it's for the first time we've built a really big project, and hopefully be very successful. So I think we do need, projects that we share a common ground to work together. Because we all have different resources. Birdwatch are by far the biggest NGO in Ireland, wildlife NGO, and I would argue they'd have much better resources than us. We have no policy officer, for example, so it's quite hard when a lot of our volunteers, you're busy doing other things, to try and find the time to work together. So unfortunately it's driven by projects, and this MPA project hopefully will forge much stronger relationships between the NGOs that are involved, including Birdwatch and the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group.
Hopefully. And from your perspective, Brian, you, of course, I'm sure, are going to see the value in cooperating with other groups and organisations such as the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. Yeah,
and I suppose echo what Simon says. I think it's fair to say that within the NGO sector, there's often pressure in terms of funding or finances or capacity, and that leads to doing less collaborative work than we potentially like to. I think we in Birdwatch Ireland would love to work more with people, but sometimes it's just tricky to find the time and the finance to do that. And despite the fact that we are the largest conservation charity in the country, I think sometimes there's a perception that we have loads of staff and loads of capacity, but unfortunately capacity wise we're very tight, and we do as much as we can, but capacity is still tight, so we would love to do more.
I'm sure both of you would love to do more, and if you were given a wish list, I think the first thing would be to get suitable funding to ensure you can do all the different things. I think so. Now, for both of you, I think that the installation of renewable energy technologies around the island, whether at sea or on land, has implications for the habitats for species who call the island home, whether they're on sea or on land. Now, a lot of these infrastructure, of course, are being built. Referring here to wind farms, which is the overlap. In terms of these land and sea-based wind farms, for example, what type of discussions, if any, take place with organisations like yourselves before the blades are put on the masts? Simon?
I suppose Brian probably should start, because it's much more advanced on land in terms of rolling out wind farms. You know, offshore wind's only just starting, so maybe Brian should start answering that one from his perspective. He had more experience than me.
Yeah,
Brian. Yeah,
sure. So I think it's fair to say that there certainly has been some engagement over the years on this. It's it's been a big topic. It's going to do nothing but probably grow in the coming years as we shift further towards more renewable energy sources, and we see more wind farms. From Birdwatch Ireland perspective, we're obviously as an environmental charity very pro green energy, and we want to see more of this. But I think the fundamental thing is that we want to see the likes of wind farms in the right places. And what we deem the right places to be are not always the case of where others see them. So like sometimes, for example, in the uplands, which are rich, important habitats for habitats in terms of the habitat itself, but also from a bird perspective for maybe species like hen harrier, for red grouse, for specialist upland bird species. But that might be seen as marginal land on fertile land. So good to plonk a wind farm up there, because it's not lowland intensive farmland. So not much loss. But from a bird and biodiversity perspective, it's not good. So we have worked with industry over the years to try and develop some tools and to influence policy in relation to this. So one of the projects in the past has been the production of a sensitivity mapping tool. So what we did working with industry was produced a tool by mapping bird data to try to identify key locations around the country that were most important for a group of species that would be most impacted by the likes of wind farm production, and where those would be, in order to try to provide really good detailed guidance on where wind farms would be appropriate. So I think it's fair to say we do engage, and we engage as much as possible, but there's a lot more to be done. There's a lot more to be done in this area.
Yeah, I think that's the case, and definitely just from the idea of wind farms at sea, Simon, where I live in the Netherlands, I mean, it's prevalent. I mean, you see huge wind farms at sea, and of course I know it's a different environment. The North Sea is not as, let's say, energetic as the Atlantic Ocean might be, and it might be a little bit easier to implement these type of structures. But when I look out at them, I have to say, I think they look really impressive, and it's great to see this green energy turn, and they were producing energy from wind and not just thinking about it on land. But I always try and picture that type of an array, this matrix of wind farm or wind turbines placed, for example, off the coast of Kilkee, where I visit quite frequently, and I'm not sure if I would want to see
They're on their way, Barry. They're on their way. Yeah.
Well, there you are. They're on the way now. But the thing then is, the question is that, do you think their implementation will negatively affect the habitat there for species that are visiting and passing through?
Yeah, I think it could do. I think, to be honest, I think we're getting very good engagement now from wind farm companies who are looking offshore. Obviously, there's a massive push now to go offshore to try and avoid some of the human conflicts on land. And we last year we published our offshore wind farm policy document, and it was a way for us as a group to kind of think, well, what are the issues? What do we recommend? Because there's quite a void of recommendation and advice there at government level. So we published it, we disseminated it, and we had loads of consultations with every wind farm company you can think of, from the east coast, the south coast, the west coast. And some of the things they were saying is that, what do we think of the Irish Wind Dolphin recommendation to do A, B, and C? So that was very, very useful. In fact, we had to try to stop doing all these consultations because it was taking hours of our life up that we'd never get back. And it's, as I said, we're not the regulators. We're just putting it out there. These are things you need to consider.
Yes, of course.
I feel that the companies want to try and do the right thing. They don't know what the right thing is. I don't think we can import experiences wholesale from the North Sea because, as you said, it's a very different environment, very difficult biological communities that we're interacting with, so there'll be different issues. But I think we can learn a lot, say, from Scotland especially, where it'd be more similar environment. Our biggest gripe at the minute is the lack of guidance from government level. So you've got all this money being spent now looking at site investigations and potential farms and connections to the grid. But every company is doing something slightly different. So what we're saying to government is stop letting the tail wag the dog. You need to set guidelines out so everyone has a level playing field, so we get that primary data on distribution abundance. Same with the seabirds. We've still got that lack of primary what occurs where and when. So what is the receiving environment? What are the pressures? But when you come back to Kilkee in 10, 20 years' time, Barry, there will be offshore wind there because obviously the Shannon has the grid connections. We're reliant on offshore floating wind devices because you can't pile them. So there's huge engineering challenges ahead. But I would argue that they're spending hundreds of millions on these wind farms to harness that energy. The wind companies don't own the wind. We own the wind, and we need to benefit from it. So we need to make sure that like we're arguing that there should be a percentage of the turnover, for example, of wind farm that goes into an ecological enhancement fund. Let's use these opportunities to provide the resources for coastal communities to maybe restore habitats that are degraded, to diversify into different areas, because there will be loss of fishy grounds, there will be an impact. But we need that government level to set these policies in place. And I think companies that are spending hundreds of millions would like to know, but they like a bit of certainty. So I think we're actually in a good position in terms of having a positive influence on offshore wind and hoping that it will be a positive impact, because I think done properly, we can restore habitats, we can create artificial no-take zones, we can create artificial reefs, and we can provide the funding to do the research, to do the monitoring, and to re-engage with people who will be displaced. So, but again, we're probably about 10 years behind where we should be, so we're playing catch-up a wee bit.
Yeah, well, one thing just from what you said there is that it's quite clear that we're a little bit behind in the times, and you talked about a number there, 20 years. What I'll be very interested in doing is comparing. You probably could see it over my head here. Sorry, this side. This is a picture from Kilkee. This is taken at George's Head, and I'd be very interested to compare that picture to one that I'll take in 20 years' time to see what the difference is and what it looks like with a wind farm in the background or in more in the foreground, wherever it'll be. Right, let's get on to another topic, which is the biodiversity shortfall. So a review of the Biodiversity Action Plan from 2017 to 2021 shows that there has been limited progress made with regards to halting the decline in biodiversity in Ireland. And there is another plan on the way. Now, the question is, what needs to be achieved in the next Biodiversity Action Plan? Now, this is a hugely broad question, so I will... I understand that you could go on for quite some time about it, but for you, Brian, what's the most important thing or things that need to be addressed in the next action plan?
So, God, like where'd you start? It's a big question. There's a lot that needs to be done. So, just in terms, to put in context very briefly, in terms of some of the problems, we've just recently completed the Birds of Conservation Concern list, and it's showing that 63% of our bird species are in trouble. They're either on the red or the amber list. It's showing that 54 bird species are now on the red list, so those that are now deemed to be severely threatened. But some really common species on there, the likes of swifts, the likes of puffins, kestrel,
Wow.
snipe are now all on the red list, along with the likes of the curlew, the corncrake, and other really endangered species. So, like, you know, species that we very recently considered to be common sight are on the red list. So what it's showing us, our wintering water birds, for example, the latest data we have in from that is they've declined by 40% in the past 20 years. So our birds and biodiversity, it's literally in free fall, like it is an emergency. Hence the government announced a climate and biodiversity emergency a number of years ago, but we're at that level. So the response needs to be adequate. So the next biodiversity action plan, you know, it has to deliver, because if it doesn't, we are looking at losing species very, very soon. So the first thing I'd say in relation to what does it need to do, it needs to be properly resourced. There's no point in producing a plan if there isn't the financial resources behind the plan to actually implement it, put in place and make a difference. So the likes of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, they have to be adequately and appropriately funded to meet this challenge and to reverse these declines. I think in the ENGO sector we can do quite a lot, and I think we're totally underutilised by government in what we can actually deliver, and we receive very little, you know, core funding from government. But with an increase in that, I think we are part of the solution that is currently untapped. I think Simon alluded to kind of, you know, data gaps in research. Like, I'm quoting some figures here from data we have, but there's still an awful lot of data gaps out there. So this is what we know, but there are still like species and groups of species that we've really very little data on. So the first thing we need to do is we need the solid data to actually get us a baseline on where these species are at, to help, you know, figure out plans for, you know, plans for protecting them. But ultimately, we need a massive shift in the way that we farm, the way that industry works. We need to restore habitats at landscape level. We need seismic shifts in the way that we are doing things. Otherwise, we're looking at, you know, mass extinction of these species.
Well, I'm going to come on to that in a moment. My next question. What I just want to add as well is that I'm shocked to learn that the swift and the puffin are on the red list. Yep. Which is that's shocking to me, to be honest. I can't believe that. Simon, from your perspective, then, from the Irish Whale Dolphin Group's view, what needs to be achieved in the next biodiversity action plan?
I mean, the biodiversity action plans don't really cover the marine environment very well, to be honest. There's enough problems on land. But I think, as Brian said, really, it doesn't really matter what you put in a plan if you don't have the commitment, both politically and financially. You know, I was on the Heritage Council 2005 when we published the first biodiversity action plan, and you know, we failed to deliver on most actions way back then. I was on the National Biodiversity Forum for the last action plan, and you know what, I stopped going to meetings because it's a long way from West Clare to Dublin for a couple of hours meetings. It's a whole day gone by and I couldn't see any end product. So they published a new plan, and okay, there's good actions in it and some have been implemented, and they're now rolling out a new biodiversity forum for this action plan. I don't need any more plans. We know what to do. We know what the issues are, some of the key issues. You know, Brian's rolled them off there. So if we don't have the political will and the finances to do it, there's absolutely no point in publishing any more plans. And I think the government are actually doing the good people of Ireland a disservice, because there is an increasing interest in biodiversity at the local level. When I was on the Heritage Council, we had these wildlife grants that went to local communities. The value you got from engaging with local communities to look at their local biodiversity and to start doing concrete action on the ground were huge. And yet the council got the funding cut for doing those very things. Now, they've been slightly changed, the biodiversity grants, but they're still not as powerful as they were 20 years ago. Why did they do that? Was that a deliberate policy because we were giving too much power to our local communities who were asking too difficult questions? So there's no point having a plan if we don't want to implement it. So that's what I'd like to see, is proper political and financial backing to actually do what needs to be done.
Now, the farming community and those in the fishing industry rely heavily on our biodiversity for their livelihoods. How can these groups then be encouraged to take part in any rejuvenation schemes that might be focused on biodiversity and our ecosystems? Brian, what do you think?
Like, in terms of the farming community, I think it's quite simple. Farmers are farming for their livelihood. They need to make money to live, and it's not an easy thing to do. I'm a small scale beef and sheep farmer with my wife in the Midlands, and so I know how tough it is to make margins on cattle and sheep. So it's not easy. So I think the simple answer is farmers should be appropriately paid to manage land. So given that, over the past 30-40 years through the Common Agricultural Policy, farmers were incentivized to production, and that's obviously had a really negative impact on birds and biodiversity. So if we are now asking farmers to change, which we are, they need to be appropriately paid for that change through agri-environment schemes and other measures. So I think that's one of the really simple answers, to reward farmers for managing the land and producing good quality food. But just more specifically on things that we see in Birdwatch Ireland that work through some of the schemes that we operate with farmers. Just one example is we've a really good agri-environment scheme through Curlew EIP that focuses on the ground advisory and a lot of demonstrations. So there's one thing giving a farmer an agri-environment measure printed on paper and saying go do that, but if you actually have specialist advisory going out to the farmer, talking through what has to be done, but more importantly why it should be done and what results it's going to achieve and why it's important, that means so much. And then better again if you can actually demonstrate to the farmer by maybe bringing them to another farm where another farmer has actually put this in place and they can see the results on the ground. That makes such a difference. So on the ground advisory demonstrations, they make it so much easier to sell this.
Show them an example of how it's done and how it works and how well it works, and then say, look, this is the way that you could do it too, and you can see the benefits from it. From the fishing side of things, Simon, what needs to be done with the fishing industry to get them on board with these attempts to rejuvenate biodiversity and ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, obviously fishing is an issue in terms of impact, and also coastal communities. And certainly, a lot of the inshore fishermen are on their knees, and many are struggling to make a livelihood. Recruitment of young people to fishing is very difficult. So, a bit like farming, it's not in a good place. Now, some of the big industrial fishing companies are doing very well, operating offshore and taking huge quantities of fish. So I think, again, there's a lot of similarities between trying to restore biodiversity and habitats on land and in the sea. And likewise, if we want to restrict fishermen from certain areas that have been fishing for generations through no-take zones, marine protected areas, whatever it is, then we have to compensate them for that. And I wouldn't just compensate them to stay at home and watch television, but compensate them for still going out, but maybe doing some monitoring work. They're the best guardians of the marine environment. They're ones out seeing it and doing it all the time. They have huge kind of cultural knowledge as well. And that's why I think tying it into the offshore renewables by providing resources, financial resources to restore some of these habitats and engage with people on the ground, they can be brought together with some sort of joined up thinking. Fishing is not in a good place. Certainly inshore coastal fishing, catches going down, efforts going up. So it would be the benefit of everybody. But as Brian said, people have got to pay for their families. They've got to pay for their fishing boats. So how do you financially reward that switch that we as a society are trying to instigate?
Okay, right. Well, let's move on then to the species element. Now, you mentioned this already, Brian, in relation to birds, and I'm going to ask a general question then, just in relation to species and concern about species and preservation of those species. I'm always surprised at the immense variety of species there are in Ireland, and which just astounds me, to be honest. And I'm learning so much, even from this conversation we're having here about the variety that there are. And that's something there that maybe is a shortfall, about people not realising how diverse our island is, and how diverse we are in terms of birds and animals and in sea-dwelling creatures. How can we then reinforce outreach programs so people know more about these species earlier, so then they can appreciate, let's say, more their habitat, appreciate more where they live and how they exist, and maybe perhaps having that, trying to foster maybe a degree of empathy with the fact that these animals are living on the island, that we share the island with them, and that people can already be proactively thinking about those habitats from an early point in their lives. So Brian, what do you think?
So yeah, I think it's a fair point that you make. I suppose I feel that we've maybe lost some level of connection between, you know, in our lives with nature, basically. Like my father he's in his 80s. I hope you won't mind me saying that, but I've said it.
Sure he won't.
I'm sure he won't. And
No.
but you know, my dad and his generation, like he would know the call of the curlew. He would know the difference between, you know, a yellowhammer and a bullfinch. He would know his breeding waders. He'd know the difference between the snipe and the lapwing, and you know, all of this. And I'm not convinced that you skip forward, you know, 30, 40, 50 years to the people in their 20s and their 30s that they would know that. But I think most people in their 70s and 80s, they kind of did. Particularly in rural Ireland, growing up, you knew these things. You knew the call of the corncrake, the call of the curlew, the first cuckoo coming in every spring, all that. And I think we've lost some of that connection with nature. I think COVID has one of the very few bright or silver linings to COVID is maybe during that period we've reconnected a little bit more with nature. It's made us realize the importance of it in our lives. But certainly we need to build upon that, carry the momentum forward. I feel that young people, they're incredibly strong in climate change. They are the voices that's driving, I think, much of the climate change stuff. But in terms of biodiversity loss, like we often say, you know, it's climate change and biodiversity emergency. But I would agree, I'm not sure if they're quite so strong on the biodiversity side, or if that's at the fore at the same level. What can we do to change that? I think that it's important to try and make it as relevant as possible to people's everyday lives. So, like, for example, we hear a lot, like you see ads to protect tigers in, you know, the rainforest, which is great and strikes a chord with us and very important. But we're just mentioning there that the puffin and the swift is now on the red list in Ireland, and these are in the case of the swift, you know, these are species that live literally amongst us, you know, in our houses, in towns and villages and cities all across Ireland, and they're now on the red list, really endangered. So I think we need to do more to make it relevant to people's lives, to bring it home, to really, you know, drive the message about stuff that's going on our doorsteps and around us. And then finally, I think it's important as well, just there's an awful lot, like the stats I'm talking about here, the figures I'm spouting out, they're a bit alarmist, and they are, because they are alarming, but we also need to be careful with that, because if it's portrayed as too alarmist, people can kind of gloss over and go, sure, what can I do about it? So I think we need to kind of provide opportunities for folk to engage with nature in other ways, and to just try and bring it to that, you know, local level, and provide those opportunities, go out for walks, listen to the dawn chorus, you know, events to create awareness and education about what's on the doorstep.
Yeah, I agree with all the things you said, and I'm going to just repeat this as well. I'm still shocked about the swift, to be honest, that it's on the red list. That really is shocking. From the viewpoint of the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, then, Simon, outreach programs to get people to know about the species that are visiting our shores. As I mentioned at the start, I was looking out and I'd never seen a whale before off the coast of Ireland, and suddenly there was a whale, and it was confirmed by someone who was in the know. So how do we get people to know more about these type of species, or coming to visit our shores, and to get people to have that empathetic relationship with these species?
Yeah, I mean, I agree a lot with what Brian said. It's as though we've kind of swapped notes before the programme, but of course we haven't, so it's interesting we're both talking about the same things. Obviously birds are more accessible because, you know, people engage them on a day-to-day basis. So when you talk about the marine, certainly things like whales and dolphins, you know, they do seem less accessible, so it's quite a challenge to try and make it available and real to people. I mean, whale watching is taking off hugely in Ireland, still massively underdeveloped. We could do a lot more of it. And I do think you go out and experience marine for yourself. It does hopefully change you a small bit, although I'd be sceptical about adults and their ability to change their behavioural patterns. So I do think it's important, just as Brian was saying, is that we have more locally based media Basin Island, celebrating our huge biodiversity, which, by the way, is actually much greater in the sea than on land. We actually have this biogeographical lack of species because the island's quite a small landmass, whereas in the sea we actually have the opposite. We have such a range of habitats, so we have massive biodiversity, but it's not accessible to people, is it? So how do we share that? Through Irish-made programs presented about Irish habitats and Irish people, and people telling their stories as well. I think there's been some fantastic programs on RTE and TG4 especially, but they're not regular, are they? I mean, we still get to, David Attenborough talking about the Pacific, which is grand, but I'd rather have somebody in Ireland from Limerick talking about the west coast of Ireland. So I think that's really important to make that connection with people. And we do need accurate, real ambassadors to celebrate Ireland. Our biodiversity shouldn't be seen as a problem. It shouldn't be seen as an issue we have to kind of deal with. We should be celebrating and treasuring it because we are unique and so lucky in Europe, if not the Northeast Atlantic, to be, certainly from a marine point of view, to have this. So how do we make that connection? It is a challenge, but I do think, it's all about social media and getting the message right these days. And we just need to keep pushing it and getting people out. Sea swimming, look at that, fantastic. People are getting out there experiencing the cold, the wet, and also the exhilaration of swimming in the sea. And if a dolphin swims past you when you're sea swimming, hallelujah, hopefully you've changed as a person.
Yeah, I think that's all very, very good points. And I think it brings me on to my last question then for the both of you. And it's about, calling people and getting them involved. And one of the elements that you mentioned at the very start is in relation to the idea of data collection and data science. And I'm referring here now to the citizen science model in terms of data collection. How can push towards more of this citizen science approach towards data collection really help your organisations moving into the future? Brian, for Birdwatch Ireland, how important is this approach?
Well, quite simply, without the incredible volunteer network that we have that are going out doing the bird counts for us, we wouldn't have this data, and we wouldn't be able to produce this information as to prioritise which species need help, because we simply wouldn't know. So it's critical. Without this survey data that the volunteers collect, we would be completely hampered as to be able to figure out which species are doing well, which are not, and which need conservation help. So it is absolutely critical. And there's a huge range of surveys. It's not just the specialized water bird surveys or whatever, right down to the level of the garden bird survey will be starting now in a few weeks' time. It gives us really important data on the health of our regular garden bird species and how they're faring, the impacts of weather, for example. So there's a survey for everybody, from expert birdwatcher to complete beginner. They're all on the Birdwatch Ireland website, so that's where you go to check them out. But the data coming from those, critically important to us as an organisation. We couldn't work without them.
Well, there you go. There's the call as well to get people involved. You slipped it in there, and I'll give you an opportunity to repeat that again at the end. And Simon, then, for the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, the citizen science approach, the citizen science data collection approach, how important is that to the organisation and moving forward?
Oh yeah, it's essential, and like I said, it underpins everything we do really. In terms of supporting marine tourism, encouraging people to go out and see it, to identify important areas for offshore wind is critical. And I think what's really important, and people might miss it a wee bit as citizen science has got so much more trendy in the last sort of couple of years, is that we need to be very robust in our use of that data. We need to make sure that it's validated. And sometimes when people send in records for us, they wouldn't have the same discipline as maybe many of the bird watchers who are kind of used to being challenged about their ID and stuff like that, is that we ask a lot of questions about what did it do, where was it, what was the group size, because you're trying to validate that it is what it is, what they said it is, because it's quite hard to identify different dolphin species and whales blows from a distant horizon. So a lot of people get a bit frustrated with our sighting officer, our stranding officers who validate all the records that come in. But unless we do that, then the data is not going to be used for anything. You've got to trust the data. So we are. Well, it's funny, interesting, Barry. When we set the Whale and Dolphin Group, we thought a lot of the kind of the seabird watchers would support the group, and some do, but we found not as many as we thought. They're very loyal to birds, and they might throw in a few sightings. So we've almost had to train a whole new cohort of citizen scientists to support kind of our work. But then they're very loyal to us. But you have to keep feeding it. You keep bringing more people in. You have to give them support into the training courses, resources, experience, and the person has to commit to doing it, because it takes a long time to become a good, experienced citizen scientist where the data can be used. So that's our commitment to support them, but also we need people to commit to doing it in the long term and build their own personal experience. And then the data becomes really useful, and then we can force change.
Absolutely, completely agree. I mean, getting people involved is one thing. You have to train them, that's the next thing. And then hoping that they'll proactively go out and collect the data in the way that you would like them to do so, while also improving their skills and maybe recruiting people along the way. Well, I want to say thanks very much for the very engaging conversation. Thank you very much to you, Brian Cafferty from Birdwatch Ireland. And thank you very much to you, Simon Berrow from the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. One last thing though, to recruit people for your cause and just so they can learn more about your organizations, where can people get more information on your organizations? Brian.
So to get more information or to sign up as a member, go to our website. Just Google Birdwatch Ireland, you'll get it. We're also on Twitter and Facebook.
Perfect. And Simon?
Yeah, ditto. Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, iwdg.ie, Indigo Whiskey Delta Golf, and everything's on that. And likewise, we're on all the social media platforms. But the website is the primary source of information, and we'd encourage people to go to that and get what they want from it. It's all there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much to you both once again for joining us here for Sea and Sky, the Science of Conservation, as part of the Midlands Science Festival for Science Week 2021. We are in debt to both of you for giving your time for this very interesting conversation. And thank you to all of you watching this who've sat back and enjoyed this fascinating discussion in relation to the sea and the sky and the species that call the island home, but also the species that call the seas and the ocean around our beloved island a home. I've been your host, Dr. Barry Fitzgerald. Thank you very much for joining us today. And in the meantime, please think about conservation and think about biodiversity. And thanks for tuning in.